Okay, so good day, everyone. Our topic for today is about summary of findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So upon the completion of the chapter, the student demonstrate understanding of to be able to provide the summary, conclusion, recommendations that discuss the insight gained in the findings, to present what is all about the study and how the conducted study contributes to the body of knowledge, and to learn in giving suggestion from the results related to the topic. In this discussion, or in this chapter actually, chapter 5 includes a summary of the main findings of the study. It also presents the significance of the study and the relate findings to the objectives and problems written in the introduction part of the study. You present your interpretation of the results given in results section, draw conclusions from your analysis of those results, and then make recommendation based on your analysis. In short, tell your reader what your result mean and what action should be taken as a result of your findings. When we say summary, it summarizes the result based on the statement of the problem or objectives in answered in results and discussion. Should isolate all the important points, review all the ideas of your list. Summary does not require you to critique, you just summarize the content briefly in order to establish for the reader the ideas of the study. When we say conclusion, it merges with the findings of the study. If there are 3 summarized results, it should be 3 conclusions. For IT or IS, it is not required conclusion because capstone project is designed while computer science is thesis. So, but most of the schools and universities still requiring the conclusion part in manuscript, which is prerogative of their institutions. For recommendations based on the conclusion may include further research of the study. It may also include a direction on how to use the software products in order to achieve maximum benefits for IT students. The conclusion and recommendation may be combined or in long reports presented in separate section. If there are no recommendations to be made as a result of the project, just call this section conclusions. The conclusion section sum up the key points of your discussion, the essential features of your design, or the significant outcomes of your investigations, as each function is to round off the story of your project. It should, number 1, be written to relate directly to the aims of the project as stated in the introduction. Number 2, indicate the extent to which the aims have been achieved. Number 3, summarize the key findings, outcomes, or information in your report. Number 4, acknowledge limitations and make recommendations for future work, if applicable, of course. And last is highlight the significance or usefulness of your work. Now, I just want to share to you a video wherein it gives more explanation about on how you'll be able to write your chapter 5, no, the summary of findings, conclusions, and recommendations.
Hello everyone, welcome to this video presentation on how to write the end chapters to your thesis, so the findings or the results, the discussion, and the conclusion chapters. Now, not all dissertations or theses will follow the same format. It will depend on the discipline you're in, and it might also depend on the topic that you're researching. So the actual research might shape how these chapters look in your thesis. So what I'm going to show you here are really just some ideas and some components that most readers will expect to find in these chapters. But you will need to think quite carefully, and I suppose talk to your supervisor about exactly what will go into these chapters. Okay, so aside from what goes, what the genre of these chapters is, I want to just discuss conclusions in a thesis generally and to show you how they relate to higher order thinking skills. So your last couple of chapters tend to have a pyramid shape. You begin with the very close findings from your data collection. So you're taking your data, you're analyzing them, and in the analysis, you're pulling things apart. So if you were collecting interview transcripts, then what you would be doing is taking those interview transcripts, pulling them apart, regrouping and reorganizing them in order to come up with some kind of result. So you're taking the close findings, and this is the analysis. The next type of conclusion you have is the synthesis. And this is usually the discussion. And what this means is you take those findings that you've extracted from your source data and you now try to make sense of them. So you're trying to put them back into a context. And you would do that by going back to the literature, referring to practice, looking at policies if that's your particular area. But you're synthesizing your findings with something else. The third set of conclusions is evaluation, and that's where you take a step back and you say, okay, now that we've been through this process, what can we say? And at the end of the day, you might say, well, the study would have been stronger if I'd done this, this, and this, or that this data was exceptionally rich, but perhaps it needed a longer time period. So there you are showing your reader your critical assessment of your results. Okay, let's move on to the first set of conclusions, which is presenting your findings or results in some way. I guess one of the key things to understand about this chapter is that you're not putting all your results in. You're not putting all your data in this particular chapter. What you're trying to do is to organize it in some way and then present it to the reader. So those are two different steps, organizing and presenting. And in the organizing and presenting, you then can work out what the key results will be that you want to present in this chapter. For most dissertations, you will collect probably way more results than you'll actually show. So the organization and the analysis takes place away from the thesis. And what you need to show in this chapter is what you've done, because your reader can't see that. So in this chapter, you report on the analysis process and then what you found, which will be the key findings. So the way to do this would be to perhaps go back to your research questions and to work out your results according to the research questions, if that's a useful framework. There might be other ways of organizing the data. Perhaps if you did a survey, you would present the data according to the questions that you asked. Just think about how you would organize this data so that your reader can get it in digestible chunks. You might want to arrange it chronologically as the results emerge. So, for example, if you did a small survey and then an interview, you might present the survey results first and then the interview results. However, if you're looking at your results thematically, then you might present the themes and use the source data from both the survey and the interview results under the themes. Your particular research field may have some other ways of organizing the research. Perhaps a context is important on land, in water, something like that. So just think about the most logical way to present your results. And then there are lots of ways of actually presenting the data. You know, what interesting ways can you think of to actually present this data so that your reader can see it visually, as well as, you know, read the explanation or the mediation that you're giving in the text. So can you put in, boxes with narratives, profiles of your participants, tables with kind of themes with descriptions, diagrams, graphs, images. Think quite creatively about how you can present this data. And if you do present your data visually, then the text needs to explain that visual. So although the visual should be able to, the reader should be able to read it, and it should stand alone, the text should still explain what's in the visual and why that's important. So in your findings section, really what you're doing is you're describing the results and you're showing what those results show. You want to make it as readable as possible, and really what you're showing is the story of these results. Not all dissertations separate the results from the discussion. So you might have a thesis where you present the results, and then under each section you provide a discussion as well. That's a decision you'll have to make. Some dissertations have more than one results chapter. So for example, if you had survey data as well as interview data, you might have different chapters showing the results from those different sources. Yeah, there are many different ways to present data and very creative ways. So have a look at other examples. If you can read other dissertations, do that. But look at published papers. I mean, people present their results in very interesting ways, you know, diagrams or organograms or relationship diagrams, you know, which is really, you know, that's an interesting way to present your results. So in terms of how you write this, you really are describing the results at this point. It's only in the discussion that you begin to synthesize and analyze those results or interpret them. At this point, you're just showing the results of your analysis. So that requires description. You're using very precise language in this chapter. I mean, this is what gives your thesis reader confidence in your results. Is how much attention you pay to precision and accuracy. So if you use a term in your results, you know, at the beginning, so say perhaps you use teacher, and then towards the end you're using lecturer, right? There's an inconsistency there, and your reader's going to say, are we talking about the same people? Is it the same concept? Is there a different approach attached to lecturer? So make sure that your terms that you're using are accurate throughout this particular stage and throughout the thesis generally. Yeah, so this chapter presents the results of your analysis. In the next chapter, the discussion chapter, this is where you begin to interpret and pull together and synthesize the results. So what you're doing is you're taking your close results and you're now saying, okay, what does this mean? Again, here you might want to work out how you want to present the discussion. So you might go back to your research questions and actually present the discussion as you know, you probably wouldn't really be answering the research questions, but you'd be addressing them. So that might be one way to shape the discussion. Another way might be to return to the literature and to perhaps pick up on themes in the literature and then show how your results can be interpreted in the light of the literature. So think about how you want to present this discussion chapter. What's the story you're going to tell? At some point in the discussions chapter, you want to find closure on your research questions. So your reader must be able to see that you have somehow answered those research questions. And somewhere in the discussion chapter, you also want to go back to the literature. So you want to show how your findings fit the literature, the theory, and possibly even practice. So if you already have a chapter on findings, then in the discussion chapter, you might want to summarize those findings at the beginning. And what you're trying to show is how does your research differ, confirm, add to the literature? How does it contribute and where does it differ? You might want to do this around particular themes. As I've said, you might want to use the research questions. And really what you're doing is you're describing the broader patterns, principles, relationships. So this is really where your findings fit into these broader principles, patterns, and relationships. Okay, so in the discussion chapter, this is where you make knowledge claims. So this is where you're showing the contribution of your thesis. You're saying, after doing this research, this is what I can now claim. And this is where this study contributes to knowledge. And the third thing that you're doing in this particular chapter is to show the originality of your work. So as you're comparing it to the literature, you're emphasizing where your work is different and where it fills a gap in an existing gap in the literature. So the discussion chapter discusses and evaluates conflicting results. So perhaps in your findings, some things fitted quite neatly, but some things didn't. This is where you might discuss that. You might also discuss unexpected findings that you have, difficulty explaining. That might be a place to discuss it. You could also identify weaknesses and limitations. And you explain the implications of your findings, why they're important, how they affect our understanding of the research problem you've identified. And at some point, you'll revisit the conceptual framework, discuss how useful it was in terms of understanding this research problem, or perhaps, limitations if that's important. So the discussion chapter is extremely important in the thesis, because honestly, this is where the meat is, and this is where your reader really wants to find out what you know. And if someone is going to cite your dissertation, this is the chapter they would cite. So it's quite an important one. So let's have a look at an outline in the column on the right. You could, this is just a suggestion, but this is what you could do, is summarize the findings, interpret the findings, and by this I mean make sense of it for your reader in terms of answering your research questions. So here you would explain the results, you'd interpret them, you might deal with issues that you hadn't expected. Then compare those findings to the literature, and this is where you are synthesizing. And maybe even then make sense of it even further, the implications of these findings. Do they improve, add, or change the field? Then the evaluation of the study. So this is the critical overview of the study. And then finally, you may want to put in a section on recommendations or future research. And the recommendations could be recommendations for practice, recommendations for policy, recommendations for future research. The recommendations is not something that is always found in these chapters. It depends on your particular field. If you're in a discipline that is much more professionally oriented, you're more likely to find a recommendation section. So just some tips to help you on the way is once you've written your chapter, then go through the chapter with a different color pen and play the dissenting voice. So wherever you make an argument, then make a counter argument. And this is just to see whether or not your results will stand up to that counter argument. At this stage, you may be very tired of your thesis, so you want to try and see your results with new eyes. If you can get someone else to help you, they will be able to see how important your research is, whereas your view might be a bit more jaded, and you might think, well, there's nothing new here. And then think of creative ways of presenting the discussion chapter. Put in visuals, diagrams of your entire thesis, if you can, to show visually how everything fits together. In some dissertations, there will be a conclusion chapter as well. In other dissertations, the conclusion is a section of the discussion chapter. So this is something you would need to decide. But generally, in the discussion and the conclusion chapter, you're not introducing any new material. What you're doing is you're making sense of the material that you have already presented in the thesis. So if at some point you find a text, a source that's absolutely brilliant and helps you to interpret your results, then you would need to go back and build that source into your literature review so that it wouldn't be new in this chapter. So the conclusion really pulls everything together for your reader. So this is where you summarize your entire project. But rather than just a descriptive summary, what you're trying to show in summarizing is how everything fits together, that there's an alignment with what you set out to do, how you went about doing it, and then what you found. And that what you found really justifies the rationale that you claimed at the beginning for doing this research. And that what you found is really significant and important. And that the evidence accumulated throughout the whole thesis and the arguments made throughout the whole thesis really come down to this point here where you show why it all makes sense. You might also include the critical evaluation of the research project in this section rather than in the discussion. The same thing with future research. You might pose new questions that came out of this research as a way of ending off the thesis. And you might put the recommendations in the conclusion rather than in the discussion. But the main point of a conclusion chapter or a conclusion section is to get across a key message. And the key message is really what is the main message that you want to get across.
Okay, so I will give you an additional video related to the discussion of summary of findings, conclusion, and recommendations. Again, if you have some questions related to our discussion, do not hesitate to post your question in our chat box for me to answer all your queries or your questions.
Okay, now, so let's discuss the chapter 5 or the last part of your research, which is your chapter 5, the summary of findings, conclusions, and the recommendations. But before we proceed to this chapter, balikan muna natin si chapter 4. So in your chapter 4, doon na kayo, 'di ba, nakapag-collecta na kayo ng data. And then after nun, sa chapter 4 is ininterpret nyo na or nagkaroon na kayo ng analyzation doon sa mga data na nakalap ninyo. So you already also interpret the data, kung ano yung pagkakaunawa ninyo sa mga data, sa mga sagot ng inyong mga respondents. So that is in your chapter 4. So, bakit ko siya sinasabi? Kasi, yung chapter 4 is quite related to your chapter 5. Kasi, from your chapter, from your interpretation, is magkakaroon na kayo ngayon ng summary of findings, conclusions, and the recommendations, which is based on your chapter 4, which or the interpretation. Okay? So, sa inyong chapter 5, meron lamang kayong 3 parts na gagawin dito. And that is your summary of findings, conclusions, and the recommendations. So in the first part, we have here the summary of findings. Again, summary of findings na nagkamali lang ako ng type. So that is the summary of findings. Okay. So in the first part of your summary of findings is we have the introductory part. So the introductory part, guys, is just a sentence or a paragraph na nagkakaroon lang kayo ng kumbaga, ina-explain nyo lang dito kung ano yung mababasa namin in your summary of findings. So, hindi nyo naman siya i-elaborate masyado. So, keep it short, okay? Maikli lamang yon na explanations kung ano yung nasa summary of findings ninyo. So, that is your introductory part. Okay? Nasa first part yan. Nasa pinaka-itaas. Okay? So, the next is the present the summary of findings. Paano nyo ipe-present yung summary of findings nyo? So, ang gagawin nyo dyan is pumunta kayo sa inyong chapter 1 and look for your SOP. Dahil yung SOP na yon ay gagawan nyo ng sagot or kumbaga sasagutin nyo yung mga tanong na nakalista dun sa inyong SOP. And that is your way to summarize the findings. Okay? 'Di ba? From your SOP, sasagutan nyo siya based dun sa mga nakalat nyong information or data from your respondents. Nakukuha po ba? So, I hope na nakukuha yon. So, that is your summary and findings. Okay? So, again, ang summary and of findings nyo is naka-based yan sa inyong SOP. Sasagutan nyo lamang siya. But, again, generally, hindi nyo na siya sasagutan isa-isa na, halimbawa, from your question number 1, lahat ng mga nasagot, lahat ng mga sumagot doon sa number 1 na yon, isusulat nyo pa rito? No. Ang gagawin nyo lamang is magkakaroon kayo ng general explanation or general answer doon sa specific na questions na yon na nandun sa inyong statement of the problem. So, kung halimbawa meron kayong 4 or 5 statement of the problem, sasagutin nyo yon isa-isa, but based yon dun sa inyong findings or dun sa mga data na nakalap nyo from your respondents. Okay? But generally nyo nasasagutin yon. Okay? That is your summary and findings. And sa summary and findings nyo, tatandaan na nakasulat ito dapat in past tense. Okay? Kailangan nakasulat siya in past tense form. Dahil you already done in collecting your data and you na-interpret nyo na siya. So, kaya siya nakapasok or kaya siya dapat nakasulat in positive, in past tense form. Okay? So, that is your summary and findings. The next part of your chapter 5 is your conclusion. So, sa ano ba yung ginagawa natin sa conclusion? You are concluding something. Kumbaga, ito yun na yung pinaka-end ng inyong research. Okay? Ang conclusion is realization from your data or from dun sa inyong study. Okay, that is your conclusion. Magkakaroon na kayo ngayon ng realization dun sa inyong study. So, ano ba yung conclusion? So, conclusions is based on your summary of findings. Again, naka-based din ito sa inyong summary of findings. Hindi kayo pwedeng maggawa ng conclusions nyo na hindi po kasama sa inyong summary of findings. Dahil, ang conclusions is nanggagaling po yan sa inyong summary of findings or dun sa inyong mga nakalap na data. So, ang conclusions is nakasulat yan sa present tense. Okay? Kung kanina dun sa may summary of findings nyo, sa first part is nakasulat siya in past tense form. Ito naman is nakasulat in a present tense form. Okay? The conclusions is the general findings, not specific findings. So, general findings. Okay? So, tatandaan ninyo na paano ba to? I-explain nyo na siya generally. Okay? Hindi siya yung specific na i-state nyo pa lahat-lahat. Okay? Kasi tapos na kayo tapos na nyo nang gawin yan dun sa inyong chapter 4, which is the interpretation. So, dito naman sa conclusion, ano lang yung mga findings or yung mga nakalap nyong information na i-explain nyo siya generally. Okay? It is based on your SOP or dun sa summary of findings nyo. Kasi diba sa summary of findings nyo, sinagutan nyo dun yung SOP ninyo. So, that is conclusion. Okay? And the last one would be the recommendations. So, ano ba yung recommendations? So, simply means recommending your research findings to a person or a group of people. You are just basically going to recommend your research, your research study to the other people. Kasi maaaring maging helpful yung research ninyo sa ibang tao. Ganon yung recommendations. You are recommending your research findings. Okay? So, ano yung makikita natin sa inyong recommendations? Again, in the first part, magkakaroon ulit kayo ng introductory part. Okay? Singit ko pala, nakalimutan ko kanina. Dito din pala sa inyong conclusion, same lang din yung magkakaroon din kayo ng konting introductory part. So, yun lang. Okay? And then, ganun din dito sa recommendations. Meron lang konting introductory part kung ano yung mababasa namin in your recommendations. Okay? So, maiksi lamang yon. The next is the recommendation should only be based on your findings. So, again, dapat ang inyong recommendations is based din yan sa inyong findings or yun dun sa nasagot ninyong, sa nakalap nyong result. Hindi kayo pwedeng gumawa ng recommendations na hindi naman kasama sa study nyo or hindi related dun sa inyong nakalat na mga information. So, kung halimbawa, ang inyong topic is about sa new normal educations, so ang maaaring pwede nyong i-recommend yan sa mga students, sa teachers, ganyan. So, i-recommend nyo siya, okay, by using what we call modals. Okay? Kapag nagke-create kayo or nagsusulat kayo ng inyong recommendations, tatandaan ninyo that you use these modals, the should, must, and may. Okay? Halimbawa, the teacher should, okay, ganon, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The teacher may be able to, ganon. So, ire-recommend nyo siya. Tatandaan, ire-recommenda sa Tagalog, ire-recommenda nyo yung research nyo sa ibang tao na sa tingin nyo is magiging helpful ang inyong research sa kanila. Or also, dun sa mga future researchers. Okay? Katulad nyo, di ba? So, ganyan yung gagawin nyo sa recommendations nyo. Okay? Again, meron tayong tatlong part, which is the summary and findings. Okay? Summary of findings, the conclusions, and the recommendations. So, yan lamang yung part ng inyong chapter 5. Okay? So, wala na kayong ibang gagawin dyan. Okay? Ito na rin yung pinaka-last part ng inyong chapter 5. Okay? So, ayan, magkaroon lang ulit tayo ng konting recap.
Okay, so I think that's it. You have a discussions from a foreign speaker and at the same time a Taglish from a Filipino speaker. Actually, that as what our video mentioned, no, that this will be the last part of your research. But of course, you need also to indicate the appendices, no, include of course your references, no, which is very important. I will give you a discussion how you'll be able to make a or to craft your references or bibliography. Then at the same time, your survey questionnaire must be there. Then, for example, if it is required permission from the parent, no, approval of the parent for your respondents, and must be also included in your appendices. Now, for example, if you have a lot of diagrams, no, you are also possible to include in your appendices. At the same time, your resume. Now, this will be, or your resume, your biodata, or your curriculum vitae must be included also in your appendices. But for example, if you are doing programs, so especially for ICT, no, sometimes the important codes, no, specifically, for example, the link from the system to a program or system to a program, so the code must be also included in your appendices actually. No, so I think that's it, and this will be our references. No, so we played a while ago a video, no, from this one, and another video for with this link. Then practical guide for writing research project by Balahadya, Abante, and Anthony John Edgar. And I think that's it for your chapter 5. And congratulations, because you will be able to finish your chapter 1 to 5 or your research project. So again, I will wait for the discussions on how you'll be able to do your references and appendices. So thank you and good day, everyone.